Welcome to Unmasking Government Schools with Sherry Few, US PI's weekly podcast that empowers parents to reclaim their children's education from government bureaucrats and social engineers. In each episode, Sherry delivers the latest news from the front lines of the fight for the minds of the next generation, equipping you with the tools and resources needed to join the cause.
Hi everyone, welcome to Unmasking Government Schools with Sherry Few. I'm your host, Sherry Few, and I have a powerful episode for you today. Joining me is Rhyen Staley of Defending Education. We're going to discuss his recent Daily Wire article entitled, "The Revolution Will Be Graded," in which he exposes how radical educators are weaponizing grading policies to further a woke agenda in government schools. Before we dive in, please give us a 5-star rating or a thumbs up and subscribe so you'll never miss an episode. And visit uspie.org to learn more and join the movement.
Today's episode is brought to you by U.S. parents involved in education. U.S. PI's mission is to empower parents and local communities to break free from federal and national influences, thereby reclaiming parental authority over their children's education. For more insights from U.S. parents involved in education, connect with us at US PI on X and Facebook. To join the movement, visit uspie.org.
Welcome back to Unmasking Government Schools with Sherry Few. I'm your host, Sherry Few, and with me today is Rhyen Staley, investigative reporter with Defending Education, an organization dedicated to exposing and combating political indoctrination in America's schools. He's a former educator himself and a passionate advocate for restoring academic excellence and parental rights in education. Rhyen Staley, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Sherry. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. So I'd love for our listeners to hear your story. So what inspired you to get involved in the fight for education reform?
It's been kind of a long run. I'm a third generation educator. My grandmother and both my grandmothers, and then my father, mom, stepmother, et cetera, they were all teachers. Part of the roots of my current advocacy work comes from actually my dad being the head of the local Federation Teachers Union, and seeing that side of things, and then going into teaching myself. And being in the classroom from 2007, going through a master's program, and Sherry, I'm sure you can recognize this, that when I reflect back on those days of my master's program, I can start to see the sprinklings of this ideology starting to come in, but it still wasn't fully there yet. And I worked at a government public middle school in Illinois. And then I went on to a Catholic high school for a number of years, and saw it there as well. I mean, even the private schools are not immune to this. And then I went on to some collegiate coaching for a while at a small Lutheran university, where I saw some of this stuff again. Although that institution was working on removing wokeness from their school, which maybe we can talk about at some point about how they did that. And then we moved our family out of Illinois. I went back into middle school, and that's when I really saw this full force in 2021 in a government school down in Chattanooga, Tennessee. And I can still remember the day I knew that I was done teaching. You know those turning points in your life where you're like, I remember that moment. And I had 6th grade students in my classroom, and I'm standing there trying to teach. And I had a 12-year-old screaming in my face that I had just ruined her friend's life. What did I do that I ruined her friend's life? Well, her friend was cheating on a homework assignment, and I took it and put it away so that she couldn't do that. And I was told that I just ruined her entire basketball career. That particular student who was cheating ran out of the room. We can talk about that too later on. With discipline consequences and so forth. One of their friends chased her down. So they're off in the hallways doing whatever they want. I had students acting up around the classroom, and I had this 12-year-old girl in my face screaming at me. And I'm sitting there going, I'm 41 years old. What am I doing? Mm-hmm. And so, and then this job at Defending Ed, the opportunity opened up. I felt that I could be more effective going and working for Defending Ed and kind of attacking these issues from the outside. And so that's kind of how I landed here and doing what I'm doing. And putting my teaching background along with some of my coaching background into my work.
Okay, so you've answered how you came to work at defending education with that background that you just gave us. So tell us a little bit about your job there and what your focus is.
Yeah, so my work is primarily focusing on exposing a lot of this stuff, doing research, sending out Freedom of Information acts, tracking down leads from wonderful, brave parents who send us information, and really kind of digging in, even sifting through, board documents and presentations. You'd be surprised what you find out there. And trying to connect dots for people. And then what we do is we take that information and we produce reports to try and expose it with the media, and then also to put it in front of whether state legislators or federal legislators to help kind of help them see what's going on. Because what people don't understand, especially at the state level, I know you do and your audience probably does, but how little staff state legislatures actually have, right? They don't have, some places they don't even have any staff members. And so they rely upon the public to provide them with, hey, this is what's going on in these places. And so we try to do that as an organization, and that's like how my work filters up into exposing a lot of these things.
Well, that sounds like a fun career. Sounds like fun to me because I've actually been a volunteer researcher most of my adult life, and we've done a lot of that kind of thing, looking at school district websites. I researched 12 school districts in the state where I live in South Carolina when critical race theory was just coming out, as far as people understanding that it's there in the government schools. And South Carolina being a very red state, nobody thought it was here. And I was able to prove just by doing some research just from websites that they are actually teaching critical race theory. So it's a great work that you're doing. I'm glad that you're doing it. And in fact, I'm thinking, if you are available, I'd love to have you on maybe, 2 or 3 times a year just to kind of update us on things that you're learning and things that are being exposed, because that's exactly what this show is about. And that's why it's called Unmasking Government Schools, is because we want people to know and understand that this is happening all over the country in most every government school system. So let's talk about your article now. It's titled "The Revolution Will Be Graded," and you begin by pointing out that grades are no longer just about academics. And so, what are some of the ideological motivations driving the push to reform the grading systems?
They want to create social justice warriors. They're trying to. This is a political programming. I know in that article I primarily highlight ethnic studies, and I'll give you a little teaser. We've got a couple reports that it's one big report but broken down, coming out in about 2 weeks, that will really expose even how bad ethnic studies really is. And I know and many know that it's bad, but if I were to sum it up for your audience, and this comes back to your question, it's a political programming. It's a far left political programming. They are training as many children as they can get under their umbrella to be leftist agitators. We're seeing it daily now. Last night we had an encampment in Houston over pro-Palestine, anti-Israel stuff. So it's not just on college campuses. We've seen this in K-12 with these walkouts over the last couple of years. And that's what they're doing. This programming is going all the way down into preschool and kindergarten. And what they're doing, and one of the avenues, to come all the way back to your question, one of the avenues is they're introducing it in the grading system. And so my example in the article is highlighting an ethnic studies grading rubric where they grade out the adherence to social justice. And so that's what they're doing. Same thing with equitable grading. They're incentivizing, right? That's what they're doing. They're using incentives, in this case grades, as a lever to push both the students and the teachers in the direction they want them to go, which is a far left political programming.
Right, and it's so obvious in so many instances. I was thinking about the phrase that you used about turning children into social activists, and I call them social justice warriors. And so I'm not sure if you recognize this. You probably know it, but our viewers may not know, is that the Common Core standards, which came about in 2010 and are still alive and well all across the country, in those standards at every grade level is when they instituted this idea of being socially active and encouraging children to examine problems and then use their life to make changes about these problems. So it's been in the system for some time, but of course, I think just the last decade or so is when it's become extremely obvious. And I also can relate on the ethnic studies piece. And of course, I've done a lot of research on this as well. But again, our audience isn't as familiar as you and I are about these things. So I'll give another example of the state where I live in South Carolina. The school district where I live, Kershaw County School District, had started an African American studies course. And it was right after George Floyd's death, which is when a lot of this really, the Black Lives Matters riots and all of that spawned from that incident. And that's when the school board met and they said, we need to do something to show the community, that we are going to address this. And so their solution was this African American Studies course. And I knew what they were going to do with that. And sure enough, I FOIA'd the syllabus and other documents, and it was totally about social justice. I mean, they even presented to the school board, social justice over and over again about the program. So it's definitely in many of the government schools under these disguised as what you call in your article, it's disguised as culture and history. So your idea of the idea of equity grading. So you want to tell us more about how that's implemented in the schools?
Yeah, so if we want to transition there, equitable grading, let's keep it real simple. It is a critical race theory based grading system, to put it really simply, because there's one guru who's running around making lots of money, millions of dollars, by the way, to train teachers up in this, and he's written a book. And by the way, that's how you become a bestseller in education, is that you write a book and then you force these districts to buy the book when they hire you to consult. He starts with the premise that the traditional grading system is racist. Because they do that because they're trying to justify or figure out, why do these, especially young black men and young black girls, why are they behind academically compared to their peers, especially white and Asian kids? Well, it must be the system. So anytime, for your listening audience, anytime they put the blame on the system, and by the way, you and I know there are system issues that need to be addressed. I'm talking about white supremacy. The system is built on white supremacy, and therefore that's why these kids struggle. And anytime you and I point to, well, how about the kids that just emigrated from Africa legally? They're killing it, right? Well, so that's why they always come back to racism and white supremacy. So equitable grading is starting with that foundational idea and so they go from there, and they what they're trying to do is they're trying to offset kids who are come from, that are very successful in the academic sphere, and they do that by lowering the standard of academics. They lower the grading scale. They only offer 50% and above. So, I mean, and by the way, one of my this has been going on for quite some time. This whole idea, I think it comes out of Alfie Kohn, kind of started some of this, where it's this idea of, well, you're only going to grade like homework at maybe 10%. And we're going to give a 50% for kids who don't complete assignments. And all you're doing, again, that's an incentive structure again, right? Because kids that are smart in terms of how to play the system, they're going to figure out really quickly, well, I only have to do X amount of assignments and I can, and I could cheat on them and I could get a good grade and go by. And then what happens is the higher tiered kids start to figure out that it doesn't matter how hard they work. They're going to be, there's a ceiling for them as well. And so the whole equitable grading system claims that it's bias free, that we're going to grade these kids based on these non-biased philosophies. But the funny thing is that it's very much biases towards kids who don't do work, who don't put in the efforts, who don't learn the materials, who don't do the outside readings, etc. And so it's rewarding unproductive academic skills.
And you might add stifling those who could potentially be high achievers because it doesn't matter anymore. And I think they consider it leveling the playing field. And I'm also reminded of No Child Left Behind. And the whole goal of No Child Left Behind with those standards was to close the achievement gap. So, this has been a policy position even Republicans have been guilty of. The left has been extremely faulty in their perceptions, but the Republicans have been deceived and fooled when it comes to education policy. And No Child Left Behind is a classic example that was an utter failure, and it didn't achieve its goals. But its goals were the same as essentially what we have now is what they call, and this was a theme back in before your time probably in early 2000 was outcome-based education. And their goal was to have all the children have the same outcomes. And there's no way you can do that because, first of all children would have to provide the same input to have the same outcomes, which we know doesn't happen. And then every child is different. We know that God has gifted children and given them abilities that are different from one another. And thank God he has, or it would be a very boring world to live in. This is a very exciting discussion, Rhyen. I appreciate your thoughts on this, but we need to take a short break. And when we come back, I'd like to ask you about how teachers are being trained to adopt these grading practices. So don't go away. I'll be right back with my interview with Rhyen Staley right after this. U.S. Parents Involved in Education has developed a game-changing blueprint to establish state control of education. This visionary initiative aims to restore state sovereignty, enhance student learning, and safeguard parental rights. Our blueprint challenges the influence of the U.S. Department of Education, criticized for financial coercion and mandates that may not truly serve our children. Here are 4 steps. Step 1. Analyze education funds from federal, state, and local sources. Step 2. Conduct a comprehensive cost of compliance study. Step 3. Identify state programs to replace existing U.S. Department of Education initiatives with active involvement from parents and communities. And Step 4. Shift the responsibility of education revenue back to the state. Join us next week for more insights from U.S. Parents Involved in Education. Visit USPI.org or connect with us at USPI on Facebook and Twitter. Welcome back to Unmasking Government Schools with Sherry Few. With me today is Rhyen Staley of Defending Education. So, Rhyen, tell me, how are teachers being trained, even pressured, to adopt these so-called equity grading practices?
I want to start with a little bit of defense of teachers. I know many teachers myself, family members, and they're not down with this. However, they are being pressured into this one way or another. Sometimes their jobs are being held over them, right? If you don't comply, you'll get a bad review, a bad evaluation, especially if they're not in a situation of being tenured in a government school. So that's one thing. So their jobs are being held to these standards. Colleges of Education. We did a report. My brain is a little fuzzy on when, but in the last year we put out a report on the colleges of education called Corrupted, and we exposed how the teachers are going through new current programs with all of this information as best practice. Our marquee report inside of that was Portland State University. Not shocking, it's Portland State, right? But I think it's important because courses that our teachers are required to take include social emotional learning, restorative justice. They openly state as their program mission that they're training social justice activists. They're not training educators. They're training social justice activists. And embedded inside of those programs is equitable grading, for example. And so they are being taught from the get-go that these things are best practice, right? And any of your listeners who have been through a College of Ed program, they do a very good job of making teachers believe that these things are best practice and that this is the way to do things. And unfortunately, especially if you're thinking like you're a 21-year-old, a 20-year-old, you're not going to really question them because they have expertise status, right? I mean, that they're leveraging the university and the traditional expert and credentialism of the university, and they're be able to push this stuff on teachers. So there's a lot of teachers that come out of the colleges of education, and for a lack of a better way of saying it, they don't know any better, and they've never really been told, here's this information, now actually go and read the real research on it. Because Sherry, I'm going to tell you, when with my work, I have the time to read the research, and a lot of it is absolute garbage. It is garbage. What they do is they start with a narrative they want to present, and then they fill in the gaps. And that's how you end up with all of this stuff as best practice, including equitable grading. How come no one has told this guy who's the main purveyor, pusher of equitable grading, that you keep advertising it's bias free, and yet all you're doing is biasing your stuff towards your ideology, towards equal outcomes, which, by the way, is equity, which has been going on for quite some time, right? Equal outcomes, because that's ultimately the goal. And so these teachers are, I would say, a majority of them just are being indoctrinated themselves, and they're coming out into these programs, and then they go to their school districts, they get their job, and they're told again in professional development, because this guy or these individuals are coming in to do professional development, that this is best practice. And I'm sure you've talked with a few of them over your life. They're very good salesmen. They are very, very good at manipulating people and making them and appealing to emotions. And, how do you not want these kids to succeed? And then if they have to, they bully them, right? Well, if you don't agree with this, then you must really be racist. Mm-hmm. And I can tell you that happened at the Catholic high school I was at. We had a professional development by a 60, 70-year-old white nun. And 2012, Sherry, 2012, and she was lecturing us on our white privilege.
Oh, wow.
Okay. And so that's what happens. And you see so many teachers gush over this stuff because it hits them in their emotional plane, and they really buy into it, and they just think it's the right thing. And the other thing to be aware of on the inside of these schools, it does not take many teachers to really be hardcore activists to get the rest of the teachers to fall in line. You'll be surprised, and not you so much, but your audience will be surprised that it's maybe a handful of teachers that if they have the right personality traits and are really on board with the wokeness and social justice warrior stuff, they can really make this stuff move through the schools. And so you certainly have buy-in from teachers. They really do believe in it, and they really think this is the best way forward, and so forth. So I guess there are so many different variables in this that it's hard to say this one thing here, but it's definitely kind of a trickle out, depends on the individual, if you will. But in the end, it comes back to administrators and districts, and also where they're guiding things.
Well, I think that was a very comprehensive view of how it's being pushed. And I agree with you 100%. I've actually said similar things myself about the colleges of education and how young, impressionable students enter these colleges of education, some of which many of which have already had quite a bit of indoctrination in K-12, especially today. And then they enter in these very liberal colleges of education, and they come out believing that this is right. And they believe they're doing the right thing. And it's really sad. It's a total indoctrination from beginning to end. And I do agree with you. There are some teachers there that have resisted. And I think in a large way too, Ryan, part of the teacher shortage across the country is the fact that there are people who have said, "I'm not going to do this," just like you did. I'm not going to do this anymore. And so we've lost so many good teachers, and I think it's hard to recruit anyone who doesn't already believe that these things are good. So can you tell me what kind of impact this is having as far as student performance and classroom expectations?
It's so hard to tell at the moment. I mean, we have some data, right? We have some testing data, and it's not looking good. We have our NAEP scores from last year, the national testing scores, which showed roughly 30% of kids are proficient in reading and math, right? Now that's kind of a snapshot across the country. What I would encourage your listening audience to do is to kind of dig into their local district and look at how things are managing there. Because there are areas where, because they're full of high achieving kids and families, right? Good family foundations, which we know is a hallmark for student success. When you look at those, you might find a district that's achieving really well. But let's just say these are luxury beliefs. If you're not familiar with Rob Henderson's work on luxury beliefs, those are beliefs where elites have these ideas, and these ideas only work because they're wealthy and they're highly educated. They actually are destructive towards the low income, lower class students and minority students, especially those in poverty. And so that's what this stuff is. It's luxury beliefs. Equitable grading, or equity itself sounds great. It probably works at a Thomas Jefferson High School in Virginia, right, where every kid is a top tier kid. But when you take that same policy and you put it at, let's just say, a normal everyday school, it's harmful to the rest of the student populations. Is not productive for our lowest achievers to be taught that work ethic is a whiteness problem. It promotes white supremacy, which, by the way, the Smithsonian is getting hammered for at the moment, right? Because they were promoting those ideas. How is that productive for our children stuck in poverty, to teach them that, being places on time is showing that you support white supremacy? It's lunacy, and there's pushback now. By the way, there are liberals in Silicon Valley who are pushing back on these ideas now, and so it's destructive. It's definitely destructive. It does not help these kids. And Sherry, I can remember my last teaching job, and I had a 6th grade girl, and she was sitting at her desk, and she was trying to read. And so I sat down with her because my other students were on task. And it was heartbreaking, because here's this girl trying to read a 4th grade level book as a 6th grader. And she really wanted to read, but she had no phonics skills. She couldn't sound out words. She didn't have vocabulary that she should have had. And I'm not blaming any one person, right? Because it's, again, so many variables. But it's heartbreaking, because that here's a girl that wants to learn, and she wants to be able to read, and she's starting to recognize that she can't read like she's supposed to. What happens when they become adults? Right? When they've been told that the work ethic, I don't want to be a white supremacist. So I don't have to work hard. People just give me things. Right. And so what we're doing, and I guess the big picture premise to my article too was these radicals have co-opted the government school system, and they are not only training these kids to be social justice warriors and activists, but they're deliberately under-educating them, whether intentionally or not. And, that kind of really leads to a bad place in the future where you're going to have a lot of uneducated people, regardless of race, regardless of anything else, any other identity. And they're going to be angry because they can't function in a very high technical society, if that makes sense. And what's going to happen is you're going to have a revolution.
Yes, and so that's a part of your title in the article. The revolution will be graded. So talk a little more about this revolution and how you think that from what I understood in the article, that's the goal of all of this is revolution.
Yeah, well, so, I think the best thing to use an example is the ethnic studies, because anybody who's been in education, if you peel away what they paint on the surface, which is culture and history, right? And by the way, another key word that you're going to notice: honest history. Honest history. We just want to teach honest history. No, whenever they say honest history, Randy Weingarten, what they really mean is political programming. And so what they do is they get all these kids wound up by identity group. They actually balkanize the kids into tribes. You're this. They teach queer theory. Okay, well you got your intersectionality, your transgender identity, your this, that. So they get them all. They get them personally connected to immutable characteristics. Then what they do is they start to teach them that they're oppressed, or in my case, I'd be an oppressor. Okay, or the United States has been oppressive since 1619. By the way, 1619 Project materials pop up in these curriculums. The next phase of this, the next unit typically is, then they present them with mythology and legends. They put in front of them people like Che Guevara or other far left neo-Marxist radicals, Black Panther Party, Black Lives Matter. And we're just teaching Black history. Well, why don't you teach about George Washington Carver? But they're not. They're teaching about radicals. Why? Because they need to create a mythology and a legend and legends, people for these kids to look up to. Oh, Che is cool. You know what I mean? Well, was he really when he was literally, shooting people in the head, right? And then the final phase, after they do that, is that they require them to do street activism. They call it a youth participatory action research. Isn't that cute? It's action research. It's community organizing in the Obama language, or street activism in 2025. And so again, they get them all wound up on their identities. They feed them this idea that they're oppressed and the system is out to get them. Then they offer up, look at these great models for you to follow, and then now go out and follow them. And that's how that whole system works. And they're doing this with pre-K. And it will be, ethnic studies is not as much in the lower levels yet, but definitely on the West Coast, it is starting to filter into every subject area. Minnesota just passed a law on ethnic studies mandating it, and they're requiring that it starts to get integrated in every content area: math, English, social studies, etc. And so these kids are never going to get away from this pattern of behavior that's built into the curriculum: identity, oppressed, mythology, activism. Now so they're training these kids up, and by the way, they probably know they're not going to get every single kid to buy in, but they only need 5-10% of these kids. And it's also a leadership training program, because they're vetting some of these kids for who could be the next social justice warriors. Now I want to add a new layer here. The next layer is the universities have been incentivizing social justice activism. Look at where a lot of this radical campus encampments and protests are happening at. They're not happening at community colleges. They might be happening here or there at some of the big public institutions, but they're mostly happening at the elite Ivy League schools. Why? Because for definitely over a decade, admissions departments have been screening for social justice activists. And if you and your audience were to start to dig into some of the big names that come across your desk, like David Hogg, etc. I mean, we know David went to an Ivy League school. You would be dumbfounded to see that a lot of these kids that are on TV who are the current young activist leaders went through some elite institution. Now, if it's a public institution, sometimes it's UC Berkeley or one of those names, right? That, like, not kind of surprising. And so there's this whole system that they've developed. Sometimes you got to tip your hat, right? Because it's like they got this whole system set up from preschool, kindergarten, all the way up through doctoral programs. I'll give you an example of a law school, because they're invading the law schools. There's a guy who was just on video on social media, exposed, talking about abolishing the United States, etc. He is a law school professor at Seattle, and I pulled one of his syllabi from 2019, where he's advocating for Antifa, he's promoting abolishing the United States, and this is a law school. Okay, and so what we have is we have this entire system set up where they're producing revolutionary warriors to go out on the streets. And that's why I say in the article, right, these people change they change their the thing they're protesting like we change our underwear. It's a daily thing. Today it's Israel, tomorrow it's Black Lives Matter, then it's anti-Asian, then it's transgender. You fill in the blank. Iran, right? The Smithsonian. I mean, pick the target, and it doesn't matter, because everything is about creating a revolution. And all they have to do now, they've got all these kids trained up, especially as they become young adults, and they give them their marching orders and say, go attack this thing. Now go attack this thing. And every single day. And of course, we all know by now that it's all funded by nonprofits that have big, deep pockets.
Well, you just did a brilliant job describing. Uh,
Thanks, Sherry.
I mean, really, that was a really excellent explanation, and of course, it's Marxist in its roots, all of it. I mean, that's how Mao, created his regime, was through these same oppressor oppressed philosophies. So that's one of the things I try to encourage people to understand, especially people that don't have children in government schools any longer, or maybe they've got them in homeschools, or they've grown and they don't worry about it because education doesn't affect them anymore. But what they have to understand is that we're talking about the very freedom of our country that is at risk if we don't stop the indoctrination of children here. And the worst part about it is it's being paid for with our tax dollars in most cases. I mean, most of these Ivy League schools have tons of money from the government. And I know it's really steeped in the Ivy League schools, and I can see the law schools too, because isn't that what they say? They say, oh, it's only in the law schools, right? So obviously it originated there. But I just interviewed a teacher graduate from the USC, University of South Carolina, again, where I live. And he had an awesome expose testimony about all of the things that were happening there. So it's really happening pretty much everywhere. It's a scary thing. It's frightening to think about. But then I try to think about my faith. We know that God doesn't give us a spirit of fear. And I think that we all just need to be bold and courageous. And thank God for organizations like Defending Education and people like Rhyen Staley who are speaking out on this and helping us to expose what's really happening in our government schools right under our noses with our own money funding it. So let me just ask you a couple other questions before we take another break. So what would you say parents how are they responding to these policies? And do you see that there's can be any pushback?
Oh yeah, with my position within Defending Ed, I don't have as much interaction to the parents. We have a wonderful, amazing team that work directly with parents, but I can tell you they do share. Parents are getting bolder. They're getting smarter. They know what they're starting to look at. It's not they're not being pushed around. Because when we first started exposing critical race theory, right, it was like, well, you don't know what you're talking about. You can't define it. Well, parents now can define it. In fact, I think a lot of parents can define it and they know what they're looking at long before teachers and administrators do, to be honest with you. And so they're getting better at pushing back, and they're becoming more bold with exposing things, and telling these districts no, even powerful districts, like we're seeing kind of play out with Loudoun right now in Virginia, right, where they just suspended kids because two boys felt uncomfortable with a female being allowed to go in the bathroom, and now the parents are publicly coming out and saying no, we're not putting up with this. And so, and it doesn't take, remember, it doesn't, just like it doesn't take a lot of people on the radical side of things, it doesn't take a lot of us on our side of things to push back and to course correct either. And from our polling data, we know that a lot of these issues are at worst a 70-30%, 70% in our favor of pushing these things out. And so like it's just, we just need to keep encouraging parents to take a public stand and let them know that they're not alone, because I think that's when they don't stand up, is they think they're the only ones. Mm-hmm. And then you have probably got plenty of experience with this, where they all of a sudden they find out like, oh my gosh, there's like way more of us than there are of them. Mm-hmm. And that's very true. It's very true. One thing I would encourage your listeners to understand, if they don't know this already, is that these radicals are very good at creating a fake, a fake astroturfed type of consensus around these issues. We're seeing this with cell phone data at protests, where it's the same cell phone. Like, I don't know how they track this stuff. It's not my world, but they're able to identify that the same cell phones are popping up at all these same rallies and protests, showing that even though it looks like there's like 10,000 people at this one protest, it's always the same 10,000 people at every single protest. You know what I mean? And I would tell your parents, they're doing the same thing at school board meetings. The unions are busing people in, etc. So coming back to your question, we are seeing parents, and we're seeing good parents stand up. And some are getting, the problem we do have is that some of them, their kids graduate, and so they kind of try to pass the torch on to others. But that's also why in April we expanded to the university level, because we ourselves have staff members whose kids graduated and have gone on to university level. So we've incorporated in a focus with the universities as well. And so we want to encourage those parents to stay engaged. But we see it. It's not always a specific story here or there that I can give you right now. But we know that the parents are really pushing back in their local areas and at the state level. And we work with groups like Moms for Liberty to help them out when necessary and so forth. And doing education stuff. We have a program where we train up local parents who are running their own parent groups, and we call it our Parent Academy. And we're working with them to train them on the skills and the logistics and administrative stuff that they need so they can be successful in their local communities. And they're seeing great work too, little things. And that's really important, right? I mean, that's what I teach my own children, is the little things matter. And they may not seem super big and important and celebratory all the time, but those little things absolutely matter. And so I encourage parents, when I talk to them, those little things, that little exposure, that little bit of pushback, that little email, those little tiny things build up over time. And sooner or later, you're going to see that blossom into something even more powerful.
Amen. That's wonderful. So we're going to need to take another short break. But before we do that, can you tell our viewers or our audience where they can find these wonderful resources? You talked about the Parent Academy, and I'd love for them to be able to access some of your research. So let them know where they can find that, please.
Absolutely. They can go to defendinged.org, defendinged.org, and that's where we have all of our reports and stuff and a lot of our work.
And your parent academy is there as well?
It should be, yes.
Okay.
And
All
if
right.
not, they can, and if not, they can reach out to our info account, info@defendinged.org for more information.
Okay, great. Very good. Those are excellent resources. So yeah, we're going to take a short break. And when we come back, I'm going to ask you 2 questions that I ask all my guests before closing the show. So don't go away. I'll be back with my interview with Rhyen Staley right after this. Unlocking a brighter future for education is within reach, and it only takes 4 simple steps with U.S. Parents Involved in Education's blueprint to establish state control of education. Today, let's explore the blueprint's first 2 steps. Step 1, discover the impact. Calculate the percentage of education spending that comes from the federal government in your state. Surprisingly, for most states, it's just around 10%. It may seem like a small fraction, but understanding its significance is key. Step 2, unravel the ties that bind. Conduct a cost of compliance study to reveal the hidden costs attached to federal dollars. Some districts have found innovative ways to replace federal programs, saving money and improving services. These 2 initial steps shed light on the delicate balance between federal funding and state control, showing how states have traded a lot of control for relatively little money. Join us next week for more insights into U.S. Parents Involved in Education. Visit uspie.org or connect with us at USPie on Facebook and Twitter. Welcome back to Unmasking Government Schools with Sherry Few. With me today has been Rhyen Staley of Defending Education. Rhyen, I ask all my guests these 2 questions before closing the show. So, what concerns you most about what's happening in education today, and what gives you hope?
Well, certainly what concerns me is what we've already been talking about. It's the advancement of these schools and these handful of bad actors, training our children up to be social justice activists and radical far left agitators. But what gives me hope is definitely the parents, and there are a lot of young people that are getting sick and tired of this, both at the K-12 level, but even at the university level. Really, we just had a report come out that showed that 88% of students polled on a college campus admitted that they fake adherence to progressive far left ideologies just to get through the school system. And so we know that they're not on board with this crazy stuff, and they're kids, and they're not being allowed to be kids. And so it's encouraging. It's encouraging that that the young people, they're hungry for change, positive change. They're tired of the negativity. And I think it's our job to also start encouraging them in more positive ways.
Well, that's very encouraging. So I thank you so much, Rhyen, for your work, for the research you're doing, for your organization, and all the work that they're doing to shed light on the truth. So I want to just thank you again for being on the show.
Thank you, Sherry. I appreciate it.
And to our listeners, if you found today's discussion eye-opening, please share this episode with a friend, give us a 5-star rating, and subscribe to stay informed. You may connect with us on Facebook and X at USPie and visit uspie.org to join the movement.
U.S. Parents Involved in Education is a nonprofit coalition dedicated to restoring local control of education and parental authority. By empowering parents to reclaim responsibility for their children's learning and encouraging states to move away from federal influence, USPie seeks to create a culture where parents are the primary decision makers in education and schools support families without the burden of federal mandates. If you want to start a state or regional USPie chapter in your area, please visit uspie.org and complete the brief questionnaire in the chapter section.